For a while, I tried to come up with the best possible way to describe Dungeonborne. The best thing I think I can come up with when I try to describe how this game feels when you play it is akin to how playing Arena Breakout felt as it compared to Escape from Tarkov. Unoriginal. And unoriginal isn't always a bad thing. Fortnite, when it originally decided to pursue the BR genre, wasn't the originator of the Battle Royale game format. However, over time it found its way into finding extreme popularity. The most well-known and popular BR ever. Unfortunately, I don't think that's where Dungeonborne is headed. Dungeonborne has gone through a few iterations over the last calendar year or so. Originally named Project Crawl, I did a YouTube video a while back, maybe a year ago at this point, talking about how there was some good ideas that it was trying to implement where they were at least making an attempt to iterate on the IP of Dark and Darker a bit with the introduction of some slightly different progression mechanics, like statistical breakpoints that augmented abilities depending on what your gear stats focused on, or a class that used one-handed swords as ammunition for spells. They also had a marketplace right off the rip, which was a massive quality of life improvement at the time over Dark and Darker's text-based Diablo 2-esque market system. And with the last couple of playtests, including this one, they seem to have been making some attempt to flesh out their ideas. In the past, my criticisms about Dungeonborne had little to do with the user experience in the menu system or the marketplace, or even the inventory management systems. In fact, things like the crafting system in the game, for example, attempt to give purpose to trash gear by allowing you to break it down into reagents that are used to unlock recipes for crafting new items. There are and have been great ideas around what I can only, unfortunately, describe as lackluster combat performance. Originally, Project Crawl, again now renamed Dungeonborne, had and still has a PvEvP style of gameplay, where everyone, much like Dark and Darker, goes into a dungeon, kills mobs, loots chests, worries about a BR circle, and eventually ends up fighting other players. There's even portals that you unlock or open somewhere that you find along the way to be able to either escape or go down into a harder level. One of which is like this shadow level, but we'll talk about that in a minute. The PvP and PvE combat has always been this game's weakest point. At the start, there wasn't any weapon collision, for example, with the environment or other players, so if someone blocked an attack with a shield, there wasn't any impact or recoiling. Instead, the attack would swing through whatever it hit, and the recipient would end up taking reduced damage if a shield was up, for example. That was finally modified a couple of playtests later to show that there was actually impact resistance now, and weapons finally started bouncing off of other surfaces. Games like Mordhau, Chivalry, and to an extent Dark and Darker, although much more watered down than the previously mentioned two games, all have something in common: the extreme accuracy of their weapon tracers. In these hack and slash type games, as these weapons move through the screen in 3D space, they trace a path through that 3D space. If those traced paths collide with something, damage is received, or the weapon is blocked, parried, etc., hits a door frame, whatever. The camera work in these cases doesn't tend to jostle around a lot, mainly because you need to be able to track the path of a weapon through this space in order to attack or counteract an incoming attack. This is why when it comes to things like using a long sword in Dark and Darker, for instance, you have to be relatively accurate with your parry in order to be able to get the riposte. The same is true for shields, and getting used to this took a while. It takes hours of time practicing in order to be able to really make this work. In Dungeonborne, while there are weapon tracers to register things like head hits or accels and drags across multiple mobs for cleaves, the weapon swings themselves offer little to work with in terms of dodging or attack avoidance. What is further is shield blocking and parries seem to have extremely large areas for blocking incoming attacks, to the point that it's almost comical. And the riposte in Dungeonborne ends up doing what I roughly calculated to about a 20% damage and bonus on the attack itself, with this long recovery animation on the strike, versus compared to Dark and Darker's 87% increase in damage with a much more forgiving recovery period. In Dungeonborne, this type of stuff stops feeling rewarding and starts feeling as though the combat has yet to really be fleshed out. If you compound this with these charging attack animations that lunge you forward in awkward angles, and some awkward dynamic camera work with head bobbing and camera recoiling when swinging hard or impacting surfaces, and a lot of like warp kind of mechanics where the camera kind of like shifts in phases. It starts to get off. It feels off. I'm usually a much greater fan of more steady first-person camera work. You can show recoiling via arm animations when hit, or blocking an attack, instead of needing the camera to be jostled around while in combat. That jostling begins to make the interactions feel tedious, and can even cause motion sickness in people if there's no option to turn it off.
Another thing with this game that I found a little disjointed is in the menus. For example, if you go to your settings for video settings, much like every other game, there's a breakdown of different options that you can modify: shadows, anti-aliasing, view distance, etc., etc. However, baked into this game, if you want to play it on very high, pretty settings, is motion blur. You can't actually remove motion blur by itself in the in-game menus. Instead, it's baked into this section of post-processing, where it says it includes motion blur, depth of field, and bloom. Now, all three of those settings, some people might actually like depth of field with the Z blurring and whatnot that goes on. But most gamers that I'm aware of prefer not to have motion blur. It's a nice cinematic effect for making cutscenes or trying to make highlight videos, but motion blur itself, when you're playing the actual game and trying to scan a room for targets, it starts to detract from your ability to track those targets as accurately. Most gamers, when it comes to online games, find that to be rather annoying, myself included. And one of the things that I noticed when I was watching back a lot of this footage is I was getting frustrated with tracking targets, mainly because of the amount of motion blur that was present whenever I was moving around. Again, it makes for really good cinematics, but makes for kind of annoying gameplay. In my opinion, this is something that they need to change. These settings should be broken out from one another and allow us to modify that without having to go into some type of config file to see if we could find a text option to change it ourselves. Most people that I've seen so far that main caster classes, though, in Dark and Darker, especially someone that mains a wizard, seems to find Dungeonborne style of gameplay to be more comfortable for them. There's no real downtime if you're a caster. It's more about charging a staff or an orb while walking around and then unleashing different spell options that have their own costs. And rather than having a spell count system, the casting system uses mana. This I see as a quality of life benefit for casters, but the damage dealing capability of them in comparison also seems to be a bit less as compared to Dark and Darker's damage output per spell cast. It's almost like having an abundance of spells available to you is more about managing the spell casts and when you make them versus how much damage they're actually able to put out. You can get some decent DPS, but something with Dark and Darker always made the spells feel a lot more punishing if you really landed them well. This game seemed like it was much more about spam. Dungeonborne also seems to have this dichotomy of movement, where they don't know what speed people should really be moving at. The vast majority of the time, you feel like you're kind of crawling through this environment at a slow walk, and a lot of times your footsteps feel even disjointed, almost like you're gliding on the floor rather than walking on it. But then you can find these shrines, or if you have a cleric in your party that will give you a speed buff and you suddenly remember how to run, and you fly through the area you're in for 8 to 10 seconds like Usain Bolt in comparison. There is no real in-between. The sound in this game has also had its share of issues throughout the playtests. Points, directional audio was all but non-existent. There was sound, but not very much of it. If you ended up in a BR zone, even now the sound just goes away, minus some weapon swing noises and footsteps. The ambience is just gone. Not until this playtest did I actually begin to notice the sounds of arrows whizzing past my head, or actually be able to tell the direction of an impact from a ranged weapon, where it had come from. And I mean the beginnings of this. Because even now, if you get hit from a skeleton archer, you can't tell which way the attack came from in the majority of circumstances. You can tell if it hit, but you can only really tell the direction if it misses you, because the noise that the arrow would make whizzing past your head, going from left to right or right to left. There were a few cool moments though, like this shadow portal that took you to an uber boss fight. It's like Inferno Plus. Although it looked, well, kind of familiar. The classes themselves are relatively interesting enough. There are the typical tropes like Rogue and Ranger and Fighter, although the Rogue is a little bit different. They have a CC that lasts like 10 full seconds, which is insane. And the Fighter class has a whirlwind attack that cuts to a third-person camera like a mobile game, which I really wish they would get rid of. There are caster classes split into either Cryomancer that can ice block like a mage in World of Warcraft, or a Pyromancer that slings fireballs and has like this AoE fire knockback. And the caster focuses have their
their own abilities themselves. Like there's a Thunderstaff that calls down lightning from the sky, which is outside of your class, or you can have a fire-focused one or a frost-focused one. They also recently introduced a Death Knight class. And by the time that this airs on the 4th of July, this is being recorded on July 3rd, they will have introduced a Druid on the 4th of July that shapeshifts into a Panther form with an ability that uses a leap and pounces on the ground at a distance in front of them for damage, and they also have the ability to summon a Treant. I wonder where they got that idea from.
One of the other interesting quality of life additions that I think this game has done right is the Mythril Order. So in this case, if you click on the game modes, you have the ability to choose the Mythril Order, which is 3 preset characters that you can slightly modify with very minimal gearing, but it's essentially a scav run. Something that you can do for free every so often, and you get to keep whatever it is that you find. Not bad. Your Mythril Order character is unable to wear any items that you find on your scav run. However, if you are able to extract, any of the treasure items that you find are automatically converted into gold, any wearable items are automatically converted into crafting reagents, and if you're able to find any consumables, like healing potions for instance, those end up in your inventory as usable later on. If you want to wear better gear as a Mythril Order character, you just have to level them up, and you have a menu that you can select basically free gear that you can wear. Each extraction gives you a certain amount of reputation, and then in leveling up your reputation, you can wear better and better gear to go into the dungeon with. The Mythril Order character does not have a cooldown, so rather than running a base kit on your main character, if that's what you want to do, you can just run this back as much as you want.
There does seem to be a bit of class diversity, which I like, as well as iterative class ideas more so than what Dark and Darker is doing with its more traditional approach, which I also like. But when it comes to games like this, even if you have cool or interesting ideas, or good UX, user experience, or a cool crafting system, if the combat isn't there, the game won't survive. And in regard to combat, the combat itself is both spongy and also chock full of gear disparity issues, kind of like the earlier days of Dark and Darker. There is no gear-based matchmaking of any kind right now, which makes sense. They don't have the player base to support it, not even on free playtest weeks. But when you end up in dungeons against guys in even greens and blues, when you have a starting kit, or if you're in blues and you end up against someone in full purples, that superior gear, like 99% of the time, wins the fight. It reminds me of the +3 all stats days in Dark and Darker, where guys that had absolutely insane kits would just steamroll everyone they came across. And it seems like the player base in general is kind of looking at this in relatively the same way. Steam Charts, the website that tracks concurrent player statistics, showed that shortly after the game went live, its peak player count hit around 14,500 players. In that time, I was live with Jay and Ken, just kind of memeing it up all the while. Having an okay time, but those guys and I, we could stare at a tree and have fun. And after I finished for the day, Anthony Kong Fan and Soda Poppin' both hopped on. Anthony's in the middle of doing a 24-hour stream right now. But even with guys like Soda and Anthony drawing attention to the game, since hitting its peak 2 hours after launch, it has steadily declined to around 9,000 players. It's July 3rd. Right now, 10:30 p.m. Eastern. Tomorrow is the 4th of July. People are on holiday from work in the United States, and even with that timing and the game being completely free and no one getting declined to try it out, it just can't seem to retain people. All in all, Dungeonborne feels like a more arcade-style Dark and Darker, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And if you are someone that is watching this video and you find yourself disagreeing with what I have to say, or you find yourself enjoying this game, by all means, play it. It seems as though the devs are trying, which is more than I can say for Greed is Good. And this doesn't necessarily have to be about like Dark and Darker is a better game or Dark and Darker is a superior game. It's just different. And from my perspective, I prefer how Dark and Darker has created their game so far. Maybe Dungeonborne ends up beating it. I don't know. Time will tell. But right now, the stat systems used to build gear are more simplistic and straightforward for Dungeonborne. The skill usage counts are less. The build diversity for each class is pretty much non-existent, and the use of third-party camera work for some of the skills feels very much like a mobile game. In my opinion, Dark and Darker is a much more involved game, with build choice and variance, and the combat is both more rewarding and much more punishing. People that are looking for a more casual, arcade style of dungeon crawler game would probably enjoy Dungeonborne. But I think the best way I can put this would be able to paraphrase what Repose said today when he was talking with me about it. If Dark and Darker didn't exist, I'd probably play Dungeonborne, and I agree with that statement. However, Dark and Darker does exist, and I think that's where you'll find me for the foreseeable future.